This is Scorched Vine, a Vin Noir's production of Hope's Nocturne, written by OPL Noir, performed by Carrie Storm. This is part 3 of chapter 3. Come on, Dad, he pleaded, throwing his arms up, frustrated with his father's indifference. The perimeter needs to be tuck-pointed. Manos pointed at the crumbling stone walls and their home state of disrepair. There are broken and missing slate tiles on the roof, and the cellars? He shook his head. There are a long list of wines that need to be re-racked, not to mention the posts that need securing, netting that needs to be erected, among other things that need to be done for the vines. Macon looked impassive as he stared at his son. Turning to leave, he said over his shoulders, "I've got all the help I need. Go back to Ontem." His grey eyes and tone were as flat as during the last few times they'd had this same conversation. Watching his father's deteriorating form, Manos could recall his father's easy smile. His emotions inhabited his entire face. Everything from the crinkles on either side of his grey eyes to the dimpled chin had expressions when he felt something. Two traits he'd passed on to his son. His quick wit and impish banter were staples in their daily lives, and there had always been a spark in his eyes, a light suggesting that the wheels were always turning in his head. That light always seemed to intensify around his wife. However, with her departure, that light was now gone. Frowning, Manos remembered the point when that light began to diminish, when shock and desperation replaced his easy smile. The doctor admitted there was nothing else they could do. Macon's eyes grew large, his nostrils flaring, his shoulders slumped as the implications set in. But his light, though diminished, had persisted. The man was stubborn to a fault. Despite his tears and pain, he told them that doctors knew nothing, insisted that they only practiced medicine. He'd been defiant to the end. It hadn't been much more than a week later when the neighbors had all refused to help move his mom. He could still vividly recall his father's rage, visible in the deep furrows between his eyes, the hard set of his dimpled jaw, and the puce hue of his skin. The indignity had been too much. After everything they'd been through together as neighbors, and the times he'd come to their aid, he'd expected better than their backs in his time of need. It had been the last outward sign of passion from his father. As a result of that betrayal, they were forced to wait until Kikula and the other fishermen returned to help transport her remains. Through everything, his father's back remained straight. His strength hadn't wavered. Despite the darkness of those times, Manos preferred them to this. Macon was different, with the vacancy in his eyes, the sallowness of his skin, the lack of purpose, strength, or spring in his stride. Unshaven, unkempt, and suddenly grey, Macon reminded him of his mom just before her death. This scared him. Wrenching himself out of the past, Manos yelled, "Dad!" as he chased his father. They were severely short-handed because of Macon's disagreement with the guild, and because of the guild's movements against them, they couldn't afford to hire anyone. They were struggling to stay afloat, a fact that he wouldn't point out to his father. The guild's refusal to buy their grapes and threatening retaliation against anyone who purchased from them all but killed their business. However, Manos was confident they could turn things around. He knew that between the two of them, they could take care of whatever needed to be done. He thought, neighbors or not, this vineyard will rebound. His long strides caught up with the slower Sabine. "I could just as easily finished my last year in secondary school here in Kanakal," he said to the back of Macon's head as he followed him into the cellar. "We need to focus our efforts on the vineyard." Macon whirled to face his son. "Not another generation of Sabines will waste their blood on this vineyard." His eyes were wild and glistening, his lips a thin grimace as he glared at his son. "Not another drop," he hissed. It had been the most he'd seen his father emote in weeks. Aghast, Manos felt his throat constrict. "It's not a waste, Dad," he insisted. "It would mean Mom's death would not have been in vain." At the mention of Olea, the elder Sabine reached for a small stool next to a row of casks. Slumping down, he looked as if his legs gave out. The fight had left him. The corners of his lips sagged, and that vacant stare replaced the light in his eyes again. "I need you in Ontem." Macon whispered, his voice gritty and strained. I need you to watch out for your sister. He swallowed. Help your gran. He stood, facing Manos. I've sent them your transcripts. Days later, as he watched the last of the sun's rays disappear behind the mountains, Manos conceded that his fight was over. The last of his arguments had failed. As the birds finished singing for the evening, and in the distance he could hear the crickets taking up their night's chorus, he sighed, a silent goodbye. Kikula left? Macon asked from behind. He wouldn't take you in? A while ago, Manos replied, answering his first question and not bothering to turn around. Figures, Macon said, his tone dry and flat. Peter should be here within the hour. He'll give you a ride to Ontem. He closed the door with a soft click. Manos hated that sound, the thud of the lock's tumbler falling. It felt final. His father's decision felt final. His vacant stare looked permanently affixed. He felt like he'd lost both of his parents. He'd buried both in Ontem and was now an orphan. Like his father, he acquiesced. His argument, his anger with the guild, and everyone around him was deflated. He wouldn't deny Marie a chance at a good education. He would always protect her. She represented all he had left of his mother. From his cargo pocket, he pulled out the letter he'd been hiding for weeks, ensconced in a thick white envelope with the school's gold and black insignia emblazoned on the front and back. He didn't have to open or unfold it again to read it. In the late hours of the night, alone in his room, he'd read it countless times. Congratulations, Mr. Sabine. We are pleased to inform you that you have been bestowed the Borrego Academic Medal of Excellence. You've also been awarded the scholarship that accompanies it. Upon the recommendation of the Dean of Ontem College and your professors, you've also been granted an early acceptance into the Academy's A-level class. Manos felt a small surge of hope in his gut. The side of him that always loved history and even toyed with the idea of being a professor felt vindicated. He smiled, thinking of how proud his mother would have been and of how she would have boasted that she wasn't surprised because her boy was always smart. Closing his eyes as tears blurred his vision, as anger once again put his teeth on edge, he smiled. Because anger is better than surrendering to pain, better than giving up to those leeches on the guild, better than letting go, forgetting her. Manos fumed. He thought of his mother. He could still picture her hair. They'd shaved her head to help reduce her fever, and it was no longer curled, but lay in flat gray patches against her head. Oh, how he missed her beautiful dark curls. He missed her neat eyebrows and larger than normal bright brown deep-set eyes. They were set in a face that had become too thin. Prominent cheekbones that hadn't been so apparent only 2 weeks before glowed a reddish brown and seemed too fragile to touch. He remembered her laugh, her smile, and her Cupid's bow lips that were dry and cracked because it hurt for her to swallow water. What am I doing? He gasped, shoving the envelope back in his pocket. While glancing down at the rocks, his practical side upbraided him over his waste of time. He knew better. He knew he wouldn't be able to accept it. Their financial situation alone was unsustainable. His father wasn't eating, and it wasn't just because of grief. While his gran enjoyed their company, her retirement fund only went so far. Another 2 years of school on top of what he had to finish would delay what needed to be done. Tending the vineyard, helping his grandmother, and honoring his mother's life couldn't wait another 2 years. He sat, finding it difficult to stand any more. It was then he caught a whiff of something different on the air. Orange curls and jade-colored eyes dropped into his head. She'd seemed sort of crazy at first with her Dick Tracy persona, but then she made him so mad that he wanted to launch her out of the back door. The squeaky shrimp had the nerve to call me destitute. He frowned. Who'd have guessed that within a few months she'd be right? He sighed, almost. Watching her crawl through the room as grown men flung their ashes while mumbling insults at her shocked him. He hadn't expected that. She'd been in tears by the end of it, and he could understand why she wanted to stay hidden. Then she hugged his gran twice. Guess I'm not the only outsider. Manos rolled his eyes. Still, I don't need company. I need to figure out what I'm going to do. I need to work to make money. This has been Hope's Nocturne. We hope you enjoyed Chapter 3. The book is now on sale at Amazon and Barnes & Noble.